The water came without rain, without warning, without reason anyone could explain. She had watched this land through drought and harvest. She had never seen it do this. No rain had fallen in 3 days. The water was coming from somewhere beneath. 3 miles upstream, men had built a wall. They had not asked where the water would go.
She already knew what none of them had bothered to find out.
The water arrived on a Tuesday morning without a single cloud in the sky. Temperance Greer noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly from a distance, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that the first few seconds of observation were worth more than an hour of reaction. She was standing on the top step of the farmhouse porch, a bowl of corn porridge cooling in her hands, watching the eastern fence line when the light along the lower pasture changed. Not the light exactly, the ground itself. The way it caught the early sun differently than it had the morning before, throwing back a faint silver that had no business being there in the first place. She set the bowl on the railing and walked toward it. The water moved the way water moves when it has patience on its side, spreading across the winter-flattened grass in a thin, deliberate sheet, carrying no debris, holding none of the brown, churned character of runoff after hard rain. It was clear at the edges, darker at the center, moving east to west across the lowest quarter of her 83 acres with the quiet confidence of something that believed it belonged there. She stood at its edge and looked north. The sky above Sallow Creek was pale and dry. She looked toward the Licking River bottomland 2 miles beyond Gus Whitfield's fence and calculated the angle of drainage. Then she went back inside, took a wooden measuring rod from behind the kitchen door. Silas had cut it himself, notching each inch with his pocket knife, and returned to the field. She pressed the rod into the soft ground at the water's current edge and tied a short length of red thread at the waterline. She wrote the date and time in a small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket, March 14, 1887. 6:45 in the morning. Water first observed at the eastern fence. No rain in 72 hours. That was how it began. Not with a confrontation, not with lawyers or commissioners or men in clean boots who had never felt Kentucky gumbo clay pull against a boot heel in the cold. It began with a woman standing alone in a field that should have been dry, pressing a measuring rod into water that had no right to be there, writing down what she saw. Silas Greer had bought this land in May of 1866, 14 months after the war ended, and 3 months after he walked home from it. He paid $3,900 for 83 acres of Licking River bottomland that every sensible farmer in Merritt County had passed over, because he understood something about the land that its previous owners had not. Bottomland flooded. That was its nature, its rhythm, its annual argument with the sky. But bottomland also recovered, laid down each spring with the fine dark silt the river carried out of the hills, renewed the way a slate was wiped clean. Silas planted his first corn crop in the same season he finished chinking the house walls, and the land answered him. He died in October of 1884, carried off by a pneumonia that settled into his chest during a cold snap in late September and never left. He was 51 years old. He had spent 18 years turning borrowed money and river bottomland into something that belonged to him outright, and in the January before he died, he and Temperance sat at the kitchen table and watched her sign the final payment receipt from the Agricultural Lending Association in Frankfort. He put his hand over hers when she set the pen down. Neither of them said anything for a long time, because some things do not require words. They require only the quiet or company of another person who understands the weight of what just happened. He was dead 10 months later. The land was hers. The debt was gone. The neighbors who had watched from across fence lines and from the far end of church pews began quietly rearranging their expectations for how long a 36-year-old widow with a 12-year-old daughter would last before she sold. They were still rearranging in 1887. Temperance, Tempe, to everyone who knew her well enough to use the shortened name, which was not many people, stood 5 feet and 4 inches in her boot heels and carried herself with a kind of unhurried steadiness that some people mistook for slowness and others recognized immediately as something far more difficult to acquire. She had brown-black hair going silver early at the temples, hands that showed the particular wear of someone who used them daily and without apology, and a habit of meeting a person's eyes directly when they spoke that made some men inexplicably uncomfortable. Her voice, when she used it, was low and even. When she was genuinely angry, not merely irritated, but angry in the way that mattered, it became quieter rather than louder. And the people who had heard that quietness once were careful not to provoke it a second time. Rowena, her daughter, was 15 now, dark-haired like her mother, quicker to laugh and quicker to question, with her father's habit of stopping in the middle of a task to examine something that had caught her attention. She pumped water and slopped hogs and drove the wagon to Caldwell without being asked twice. And in the evenings she sat at the kitchen table, reading anything the county lending library would release. And several things it probably should not have. The two of them ran the 83 acres with a hired hand 3 days a week during planting and harvest, and with a pair of Percheron draft horses named Canaan and Ezra, purchased in Lexington in 1879, large and gray and deeply unbothered by most things. Tempe had never raised a whip to either of them in the 8 years she had worked alongside them, operating on the principle that an animal gives more to a person it does not fear than to one it has only learned to avoid. By the end of the first week, the water covered 18 acres. She measured every morning at the same time, the red thread markers moving steadily westward, each new notation precise and unadorned. Date, time, depth at the primary marker, approximate new coverage in acres. On the fourth day, she rode north along the creek bed to the point where Sallow Creek bent toward the county road, and from the slight rise there she could see 3 miles upstream to where the land had changed. The timber was down, the brush was cleared, the raw earth showed in long pale strips between ridges of darker soil, and along the eastern edge of the excavation running parallel to the creek, a new earthwork berm had been constructed. Perhaps 8 feet high, built of compacted clay, reinforced with oak timbers driven vertically at intervals, it ran for nearly a quarter mile before bending east and disappearing behind a stand of remaining sycamore. She sat her horse and looked at it for a long time without moving. Bluestone Quarry and Gravel Company had arrived in Merritt County the previous autumn. They had leased 400 acres of river bottomland from 3 different landowners upstream. Landowners who accepted the lease money gratefully, without asking what a gravel operation would do to the drainage patterns of the land below them. The company held a contract to supply crushed stone and washed gravel for 2 rail line extensions pushing south through Kentucky, and the Licking River bottomland held exactly the deep gravel deposits they needed. The berm was not an accident of indifference. It was a deliberate structure, built to protect expensive equipment from high water, built to redirect that water somewhere else, built by men who had looked at a map and not at the land beneath it. She rode home and wrote a letter to the Kentucky Geological Survey office in Frankfort. The letter took 2 evenings to compose. She described the drainage pattern, the construction she had observed, the rate at which her fields were flooding. She attached a table from her notebook, 7 days of measurements, each entry dated and timed. And she wrote in plain sentences without qualification or apology, because she had learned early that letters which apologize for their own existence are rarely taken seriously. She sent it on the 16th of March from the Caldwell post office and rode home in the cold without telling anyone she had done it. The following afternoon, she went to see Augustus Whitfield. Gus Whitfield had farmed the property adjoining hers since 1843, when he was 28 years old, and the land along Sallow Creek was still considered marginal ground, not worth the clearing. He was 72 now, his back bent slightly from decades of physical work, but his hands were still large and capable, and his eyes held a quality of patient attention that had nothing to do with slowness and everything to do with many years of watching things closely. He had outlived 1 wife and 2 of the 4 children born to him, and he farmed alone now with a pair of aging oxen and a stubbornness regarding the value of work that his surviving children had long since stopped arguing with. His father had worked for the Kentucky Land Office as a surveying assistant in the 1840s, accompanying the survey teams through the bottomland counties and recording what the engineers measured. He had kept detailed personal notes alongside the official ones, and when he died, he left his son a leather-wrapped cylinder containing, among other papers, a hand-drawn hydrological survey of the Sallow Creek and lower Licking River drainage basin, dated August of 1849. The ink had faded to the color of old tea. The paper had gone brown at the edges and stiff with age, but the lines were still readable, the notations still legible, and Gus had kept it for 38 years because his father had told him to keep it, and because his father had said the land along Sallow Creek would need it someday, and because Gus Whitfield did not throw away things his father had said would matter. He was splitting wood behind the barn when she came around the corner, and he set the maul down without particular surprise, since Temperance Greer did not visit without reason and he had seen the water in his own low pasture 3 days earlier. She did not start with the water. She told him what she had seen upstream, described the berm, gave him the measurements from her notebook. He listened with the particular quality of listening that involves the whole body rather than only the ears, occasionally looking away toward the tree line and then back at her. When she finished, he said east-northeast, and she understood he meant the direction the water was coming from. Same as 1853, she said. He thought about it a moment. Worse. In 53 it was beaver dams and a wet spring. This is a wall. He set them all against the woodpile without resuming the splitting. There's something you should see. The map was stored in the same leather cylinder it had arrived in, tucked behind a row of glass canning jars on a shelf in the back room. He unrolled it on the pine kitchen table with the careful movement of someone handling a document they believe has more value than most people would assign to it, weighting the corners with a salt cellar, a tobacco tin, and a smooth gray river stone that had no purpose other than having always been on that table. She bent over it and looked. The creek lines were precise, the drainage paths marked in faded blue ink with small arrows indicating flow direction. The map showed the entire network of drainage routes through the Sallow Creek bottomland, including several channels that no longer existed on any current survey. Old river courses, abandoned bends, oxbow traces that had filled in over generations of farming and been forgotten. One line in particular ran in a northeast to southwest direction through land that was currently the site of Bluestone's excavation, crossing beneath what would have been the eastern edge of their berm, continuing under a section of land Tempe did not own, and then entering the northeastern corner of her 83 acres. That's not just a drainage channel, she said. It's an old river course. He touched the line with the tip of one calloused finger, tracing it southwest, secondary branch of the Licking. My father said there were old-timers in 1849 who remembered it running when they were children. The river changed course sometime in the first quarter of the century. But the sand is still there. He looked up at her. Underground, deep layers of coarse river sand beneath all the clay. Water moves through it the way it moves through a pipe, except slower and in every direction at once. You dam the surface, the water doesn't stop. It finds the sand, and then the sand carries it wherever the pressure builds to. She straightened and looked at the map for a moment longer without touching it. They built their berm on top of it, directly on top of the main channel. The water has nowhere to go on the surface, so it goes down into the sand, and the sand carries it south. He did not need to say where south ended up. She asked if she could borrow the map. He said she could have it, because he was 72 years old, and his father had kept it for exactly this kind of moment, and moments like this did not come twice. The letter from Frankfurt arrived on the 31st of March. She read it at the kitchen table before Rowena came downstairs. The Geological Survey Office acknowledged her report. They noted that Bluestone Quarry and Gravel Company held a valid commercial extraction permit issued by the Merritt County Commissioners the previous October, and that in the absence of specific geological evidence demonstrating the company's operations had caused the drainage disruption she described, the office was not in a position to recommend intervention. They encouraged her to pursue the matter through the county commission if she believed there was a case to be made. She folded the letter, put it in the notebook beside her measurement tables, and went out to check the markers before breakfast. The water that morning covered 31 acres. There were things she could have done at that point that she did not do. She could have accepted Prescott Daly's offer, which had been delivered twice by that time, once in January at the county offices, and once in a brief exchange at the end of February when he had appeared at her fence line with a younger man carrying a surveying instrument. Daly was 34, educated in Cincinnati, employed by Bluestone as their field operations manager, and possessed of a kind of self-assurance that came not from having been tested and survived, but from having moved through a world that had thus far asked very little of him. He wore good boots that stayed clean longer than boots should in Merritt County in March, and he spoke in the careful cadences of a man who had been taught that measured speech communicated authority. His offer was $19 per acre for the 20 lowest lying acres of her property, framed as generosity and recognized by her as calculation. $19 per acre for land currently underwater was not generosity. It was acquisition at distress pricing by people who had created the distress. "Where does your company's water go?" she had asked him, "when the berm holds?" He told her it was routed west along an old creek bed that fed into the lower drainage near the county road. She had not corrected him aloud. The creek bed he was describing had been dry since before the war. She knew this because Silas had tried to run a drainage tile into it in 1871 and found nothing but packed clay for 30 feet in every direction. She did not say that to Prescott Daly in February because a person who tells everything they know in the first conversation has no advantage in the second one. She spent a week in early April working the problem the way she worked any problem requiring precision, methodically, without rushing the steps. She dug 6 test holes along the arc of grass where the round-stemmed water sedge grew in its odd, slightly elevated rings, each ring a signal she had learned from Gus to read as the above-ground signature of something sandy below. 5 holes came up clay all the way down. The 6th hole, at the southeastern corner of her property near the equipment barn, reached coarse yellow sand at 3 feet and 10 inches. The sand was wet, more than wet. It was saturated, water-bearing, actively moving under pressure she could feel against her palm when she pressed it flat against the side of the hole. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a while. The sand was not where the 1849 map showed the main channel. It was south of the main channel, closer to her barn, closer to the county road that ran along her southern boundary, the road that carried Bluestone's wagon teams from the excavation site to the river landing, where they loaded their gravel onto flatboats. If the underground pressure continued building, the water would not only rise through her fields, it would rise through the subgrade beneath that road. She had seen enough settled ground along creek banks to know what saturated sand did to packed clay roadbed when the pressure beneath it had nowhere else to go. She wrote that observation in the notebook, date, depth, a careful description of the sand's color and grain size, and said nothing about it to anyone until the time was right. The Merritt County Commissioners called a public meeting for the 5th of April, convened at the Caldwell Courthouse. The notice was published in the Merritt County Ledger 3 days prior, and by the time the evening arrived, the main room held more people than it had seen at any gathering since the county election 2 years before. Farmers whose land sat downstream from Bluestone's operation filled the rows of wooden chairs. Bankers who held notes on several of those farms occupied the chairs behind them. Bluestone's company lawyer, a man named Rathbun, who had come down from Louisville with a leather case full of documents, sat at a table near the front. A reporter from the Ledger sat in the back corner with a notepad. Prescott Daly stood and spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He was good at it, organized, articulate, unhurried. He presented rainfall data for Merritt County going back 15 years, demonstrating that the spring of 1887 had been anomalously wet even before the flooding of Tempe's fields began, which was true as far as it went. He presented survey maps Bluestone's engineers had commissioned the previous fall, maps drawn at the surface that showed no subsurface features at all. He cited the company's extraction permit, cited existing water law regarding drainage rights along navigable tributaries. Then he looked toward the row where Tempe was seated. "We have heard concerns from Mrs. Greer," he said, in the tone of a man who has rehearsed the word concerns many times and chosen it very deliberately over the word complaints. "And we take those concerns seriously. Farming bottomland near any river system carries inherent drainage risk, and we understand that this has been a difficult spring." He paused with the precision of someone who knows exactly when to pause. But perhaps the question to consider is whether the land in question has ever truly been suited to the kind of farming Mrs. Greer has been attempting, and whether a different use of those lower acres might better serve everyone involved. There was a sound in the room that was not quite laughter and not quite approval, but contained elements of both. The sound of people who have already decided something settling back into the satisfaction of hearing someone else say it first. It moved through the rows quickly, the way sounds move in rooms where people are looking for permission. Tempe stood. She did not move to the front of the room. She stood where she was at the end of her row, opened the leather notebook, and set it on the back of the empty chair beside her. She read from it without preamble, without introduction, without looking up until she had finished. She read the dates. She read the measurements. She read the rainfall notations, or rather the absence of them. March 20th, no precipitation. 21st, no precipitation. 22nd, no precipitation. Water level at primary marker, up 8 inches across those 3 days. She read 7 more days of entries in the same format. When she stopped, she closed the notebook. "If this is a rainfall problem," she said, her voice carrying the kind of flatness that comes not from lack of feeling, but from the deliberate exclusion of it, "I'd be grateful if someone could explain to me how 8 inches of water accumulated in 3 days without any rain." The room was quiet with the quality of a room that has just stopped laughing. Gus Whitfield was not a man who moved quickly under ordinary circumstances, and he did not move quickly now. He stood with the unhurried deliberateness of a person entirely confident that what they are about to produce will be worth waiting for, carried the leather-wrapped cylinder to the front table, and unrolled the 1849 map without ceremony, weighting its corners with whatever was at hand. The map was old enough that its appearance alone, the brown paper, the faded ink, the notations in handwriting clearly not of the present century, changed the quality of attention in the room before anyone had read a word of it. Rathbun leaned forward with the expression of a man recalculating. "This is an 1849 document. I don't see how historical." Gus traced the blue line of the old channel with one finger. He traced it through the area that was now Bluestone's excavation, beneath the position of the berm, southwest across the county, into the northeastern corner of Tempe's 83 acres. He did not look up while he did it. He traced the line to where it terminated and then looked at Rathbun. "Your company built a wall across this. Not across the surface water, across what the surface water rests on. The sand underneath. The channel doesn't show on your survey because your survey doesn't go deep enough to find it." He set his hand flat on the map. "This one does." Commissioner Aldridge, who sat at the head of the room with the expression of a man who had expected to resolve this matter before supper, looked at the map, then at Rathbun, then at Daly. Rathbun was reading the document's header notations. Daly was looking at the channel line with the focused expression of someone doing arithmetic they don't like the outcome of. "We'll need to verify this," Aldridge said finally. "The water is already verifying it," Tempe said. "It's been verifying it for 3 weeks." The meeting adjourned without resolution, with the commission promising to schedule an independent inspection. Rathbun told the room that Bluestone stood by its permits and its engineering assessment. 3 of the other downstream farmers filed their own informal complaints before leaving. The Ledger reporter wrote everything down. Tempe drove the wagon home alone in the dark. The road ran alongside the lower edge of her property, and she could see the faint silver of standing water in the western fields, even by moonlight. 51 acres now. The water had moved another 4 acres while she sat in the courthouse. Rowena was awake when she came in, sitting at the kitchen table with a book open and a candle burned most of the way down. She poured hot water from the kettle that had been sitting on the back of the stove and handed her mother a cup of tea without asking how the meeting had gone, because some evenings the question could wait. Tempe sat down across from her daughter and drank the tea without saying anything for a while. Outside, the spring frogs had started in the low places, filling the dark with their particular insistence, the sound of small creatures that exist near water and make no apologies for what they require. Rowena turned a page. The candle shortened. The kitchen held the particular warmth of a room where 2 people are comfortable enough together that silence costs them nothing. Did they listen? Rowena asked eventually. Some of them. Tempe set the cup down. The ones who wanted to already did. The ones who didn't. And Mr. Whitfield's map complicated things for them. She looked at the window where her own reflection was faint in the dark glass, which is what it was supposed to do. 3 days later, Prescott Daly came back to Sallow Creek without his surveying assistant and without his briefing materials. He came alone, on horseback, and arrived at the edge of her flooded eastern pasture and sat looking at it for several minutes before she walked out to meet him. The water was above the second fence rail now. Both her marker rods had been submerged. She had cut new ones and driven them in at a higher point on the bank. He did not make an offer. He said he wanted to look at the Whitfield map again. She took him to Gus. The 3 of them sat at the pine kitchen table, and Gus spread the map out again and went through it more slowly this time, explaining the subsurface hydrology in the methodical way of a man who had thought about these things for many decades and can make them plain without making them simple. Daly listened differently than he had at the courthouse, not with the attention of a man preparing a counter-argument, but with the attention of a man trying to reconcile what he has been told with what the map shows him. He asked about the grain size of the sand deposits in the old channel, about the estimated depth to the channel at the berm location, about how Gus's father had obtained the subsurface data underlying the 1849 survey. When Gus explained that the land office teams had done probe sampling at regular intervals along with their surface measurements, Daly was quiet for a moment. If the channel runs where this map shows it, he said carefully, and if the sand layer is continuous between the berm location, the Greer property, then the pressure buildup would be consistent with what we're seeing. He looked at the channel line without expression. I'd need to verify that with core samples. You'll need my permission to take core samples on my land, Tempe said. He looked at her. Yes, you have it, on the condition that whatever the cores show, you share the findings with the commission and with me before you act on them. There was a pause in which he considered whether to negotiate that condition, then decided against it. Agreed. She gave him the condition in writing before he left. He signed it without asking for his lawyer's review, which she noted and filed away as information about what he had concluded from the map. What she had not told him, what she had not told anyone, was the location of the 6th test hole and what she had found there. The sand beneath the county road. The secondary channel running south of the one on the 1849 map, the one that Gus's father had surveyed and recorded, but that nature, in the intervening decades, had apparently extended in a direction no one had thought to look. She had the measurements. She had the depth. She had the grain description. She had the knowledge of what that sand, if the pressure continued to build, would do to the road that carried every wagon load of Bluestone's gravel from excavation site to river landing. She kept it in the notebook. She wrote the date at the top of the entry, April 9th, 1887. The cannon pool, as she had begun calling it in her own notes, the naming of things helped her hold them clearly in her mind. The cannon pool, 3 feet and 10 inches down, running south-southwest, presently bearing the full weight of whatever Bluestone's berm was pushing into the ground. When Rowena came into the kitchen later that evening and asked why her mother was studying that one page in the notebook instead of reading, Tempe looked up with the expression she wore when she had decided something. Because there's more than one argument in this field, she said. I just needed to find where the second one was buried. Canaan and Ezra were moved to the high ground behind the barn the following morning. The equipment barn stood on a slight natural rise, one of the few topographic advantages the land possessed, and the ground around it was still dry, though the water had reached to within 20 yards of the near wall. She stacked the seed sacks on the highest shelf, moved the hand tools to the loft, checked the harness hooks and the tack, inventoried what could be lost and what could be carried, and made 3 decisions about what order she would save things in if it came to that. She did not believe it would come to that. But she had lived long enough with uncertainty to know that believing something and preparing for its opposite were not contradictory acts. They were simply wisdom and its practical application, occupying the same mind at the same time. Gus came by in the late afternoon and stood with her at the edge of the water, looking at the new extent of the flooding. 56 acres now. The county road along the south boundary was still passable, but the ground on either side of it was soft in a way that had nothing to do with the current season's rains. He had noticed the low fence rail on his own pasture had gone under during the night. First time the water had crossed his property line, and repaired it without complaint, because that was the kind of thing Gus Whitfield did before mentioning it. They'll bring core equipment, she said. I expect so. When they do, I want to be there. He looked at her. You planning to show them the sixth hole? She had not told him about the sixth hole, which meant he had gone looking himself. You found it, she said. Found the ground soft in that quadrant. Didn't dig, but I've walked enough wet sand country to know the feel of it underfoot. He looked south toward the county road. If that channel connects to what I think it connects to. It does. She let the statement stand without embellishment, because Gus Whitfield did not require embellishment. He was quiet for a moment. You know what that road carries. Everything they pull out of the ground. So your problem and their problem may be the same problem. They just haven't found that out yet. The sun was dropping behind the tree line to the west, turning the standing water across her fields into a sheet of pale fire. In that light, the flooding looked almost intentional, almost beautiful, the way destruction sometimes does when observed from a sufficient distance. She watched it without flinching, because flinching was for people who had not yet accepted what they were looking at. She had accepted it on the first morning, standing in the cold with a measuring rod and a notebook, doing the only thing that had ever reliably gotten her through difficulty, writing down what she saw, exactly as she saw it, without wishing it were otherwise. The measuring rod she had driven at the new marker that morning read 5 inches higher than the day before. She wrote that down too when she got back to the house. The frogs started up again in the low places. Rowena was reading at the kitchen table, a lamp burning at her elbow, her dark hair falling forward over the page. The house smelled of wood smoke, and something Rowena had warmed on the stove earlier, and outside the window the flooded fields held the last of the light. Tomorrow the men from Louisville would come with their core drills, and she would be in the field when they arrived. And she would show them two things. What the land remembered from 1849, and what the land had figured out on its own since then. The core drill arrived on a flatbed wagon, pulled by 4 horses, which was the first indication that Bluestone had sent people who understood the geology would not cooperate with small equipment. 2 men rode with it, both from Louisville, both wearing the particular expression of professionals who have been dispatched to resolve a problem someone else created. They introduced themselves to Prescott Daly at the field's edge, consulted a paper he handed them, and began unloading without ceremony. Tempe had been in the field since first light, restaking the measurement rods that had shifted overnight, recording the morning level in the notebook. 61 acres now. The water had moved another 5 in the night, crossing the low berm of the old wagon track that divided the eastern and central fields, filling the depression between them until the 2 flooded areas merged into one continuous lake that stretched from the fence line to within 40 yards of the corn stubble ground. The stubble ground was still dry, still hers. Still the margin between a bad season and a finished one. Daly walked over when the crew began setting up. He had a different quality about him this morning. Not chastened exactly, but careful in a way he hadn't been before, his movements considered, his words measured against some private accounting she couldn't read yet. We'll take 3 cores, he said. 2 along the berm center line, 1 at the location you specified. My location first, she said. He considered that for a moment, then nodded to the crew foreman, who redirected the equipment without comment. The foreman was a compact, gray-haired man named Buckner, who spoke rarely and moved the drill apparatus, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this work long enough that he no longer finds it interesting, only precise. They set up above the 6th test hole, the spot she had already opened with a hand spade. The drill went in at a slight angle. Following the probe rod, Buckner drove first to confirm the ground conditions. At 3 feet, the resistance changed. At 3 feet 8 inches, the core sample came up different from the surrounding clay, coarser, yellower, grained in the way of water-sorted sediment rather than the dense matrix of the bottomland surface soil. Buckner crouched and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at his colleague, and the 2 of them had a conversation with their eyes that excluded everyone else in the field. Daly crouched beside the sample. He picked up a small handful and let it run through his fingers slowly, watching the way it fell. The sand did not offer him the confirmation he had perhaps been hoping for. This is saturated, he said. Buckner turned the core over in his hands. Under pressure, feel the weight of it. He handed it to Daly, who held it and felt it. That's not stagnant water. That's moving water held underground. The aquifer has a head on it. Daly set the core down carefully, the way a person sets down a document they've just read and cannot unread. He looked south toward the county road, where two of Bluestone's heavy freight wagons were moving a load of gravel toward the river landing, their wheel tracks cutting deep into the soft shoulder of the road. The road's surface itself looked ordinary from this distance. She watched him look at it, watched his attention stop there, watched him hold the view a half-second longer than an ordinary glance would require. She did not say anything. She had learned from watching Gus conduct conversations that the most useful thing a person could do after presenting evidence was to stay quiet long enough for the other party to finish arriving at the conclusion the evidence pointed to. Interrupting that process only gave them an argument to resist instead of a truth to absorb. "How far south do you estimate the channel runs?" Daly said finally, still looking at the road. "My estimate," she said, letting the phrase sit there so he understood it was not a concession. "Based on the probe work and the ground conditions along the south boundary, I believe it runs to the road shoulder and possibly beneath the road surface itself." He turned to look at her. "The sand grain size at depth is consistent with the main channel profile on the 1849 map," she continued. "Except that this channel runs south of the position the map shows. It's either a branch of the main channel or the main channel shifted sometime after the survey. Either way, it's carrying water. And it's running under the road your wagons use." Buckner had stood up and was walking slowly toward the south boundary fence, studying the ground as he went. He stopped at the fence line, looked at the road shoulder on the other side, pressed the toe of his boot against the ground there. He pressed it again harder and watched the way the surface responded. He did not say anything. He walked back to the drill. They took the second core 50 yards southeast inside the boundary of her property, angling toward the road corridor. The sand layer was there again, this time at 3 feet even, wetter than the first, the water actually seeping from the bottom of the core tube before Buckner could get it fully withdrawn. The third core, at Daly's original planned location along the berm centerline, came up clay. He had been right about that one. Tempe watched him absorb that small confirmation without relief, because by then it no longer mattered. The first two had settled the argument. He excused himself and walked to the far side of the equipment wagon. She could see him writing in a pocket ledger, his handwriting quick and angular, the pen moving with someone working out a sequence of implications rather than recording observations. He wrote for several minutes, stopped, looked at the road again, wrote again. Then he walked back. "I need to send a telegraph to Louisville," he said. "Today. The Caldwell office is on Main Street. I know where it is." He said it without impatience, as a correction to himself as much as a response to her. "I'll be back tomorrow morning, before 8. She nodded once and he left. Gus arrived an hour later, having watched the proceedings from his own fence line with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for things to become clear. He walked the field with her after the Louisville crew had packed her equipment, moving slowly along the line of stakes she had driven at the flood margin, bending occasionally to look at the ground the way a doctor looks at a patient. Not to confirm what he already suspects, but to check for what he might have missed. At the south boundary, he stopped and pressed his boot sole against the road shoulder, exactly where Buckner had. He held the pressure for a moment. "Soft," he said. 3 feet of saturated sand below. Maybe less by now. He straightened and looked down the road in the direction the freight wagons had gone. How much does a loaded gravel wagon weigh? She knew what he was asking beneath the question. "Enough," she said. He didn't push it further. Gus Whitfield operated on the understanding that most things did not need to be stated completely between people who were paying attention, and she had long since earned the kind of attention he reserved for people he considered worth it. He adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun and looked at the flooded fields, and then at the narrow strip of dry ground along the equipment barn. "The horses all right?" "Settled. They don't like the smell of standing water, but they're not anxious. Horses are smarter about water than people." He started back toward the main field. "When does the company man from Louisville come?" He said tomorrow before 8. "I'll be here at 7. She didn't argue. Having Gus at 7 meant having 30 years of contextual knowledge standing behind her before the conversation started, which was worth more than any document she could produce. That night, after Rowena had gone upstairs, Tempe sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and drew a rough map of the 2 confirmed sand deposits. The one from her hand-dug test hole, the one confirmed by the first core, and the position of the second core relative to the road. She drew the road as a line across the bottom of the map and drew arrows where she estimated the underground water pressure was building. She drew them without confidence about their exact paths, because confidence about exact paths underground was the mistake Bluestone had made. She drew them as probability, as the behavior of water, given what she knew about sand and clay and pressure, and she studied the result. The pressure had 3 possible relief points. It could continue rising into her fields, which it was already doing. It could find a path upward through her barn floor, If the structural load of the barn compressed the clay layer enough, unlikely but not impossible, so she added a small mark there. Or it could move south into the road's subgrade, where the repeated loading of heavy freight wagons had already compressed the surface and might have fractured the clay cap enough to let the sand breathe upward. She thought about what happened to a packed clay road when the sand beneath it became saturated and lost its bearing capacity. She had seen it happen once, years ago, during a spring thaw on the county road east of Caldwell, where a stretch of road simply sank 18 inches over the course of 2 days, as though the ground beneath it had quietly decided it was done holding up. 3 wagons had been lost in the soft ground before the county could barricade the stretch. Bluestone's freight wagons ran that road twice daily, sometimes 3 times loaded to the frame with stone. She closed the notebook and blew out the lamp. Daly arrived at 10 minutes before 8 the following morning, riding alone. Gus was already at the field edge, his old wide-brimmed hat pushed back on his head, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, looking as though he had been standing there since dawn, which he had. Daly tied his horse at the fence post and came across the field toward them without his usual set of materials. No leather case, no maps, no surveying tools. Just himself and the pocket ledger. "I heard back from Louisville last night," he said, addressing both of them. "The board has authorized an independent geological review. They want their own man here before they make any decisions." Gus drank his coffee. "Their own man," Tempe said, "on their timeline. It will be quick. 2 weeks at the outside. The water has moved 61 acres in 3 weeks. Another 2 weeks at this rate is another 40. She let the arithmetic stand on its own. I won't have a farm worth reviewing in 2 weeks. Daly's jaw shifted slightly. "I understand that. I'm not certain you do." She said it without inflection. "When the review is finished and it confirms what the cores already show, the damage to my fields will be done. An independent review of the cause is not the same thing as stopping the cause." He looked at her steadily for a moment, the kind of look that contains an argument being considered and set aside. "The board also wants me to convey that the original purchase offer for the lower acreage is still on the table." Gus made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "The original offer," Tempe said, "which you made before your core samples confirmed that your operation has been pumping water into my fields through an underground channel your engineers failed to identify." Daly was quiet. "The answer is no," she said, "to the offer, to the 2-week delay. I want the county commission informed of the core results today, and I want the berm construction paused while the review happens. I can't unilaterally. Then whoever in Louisville needs to." She turned slightly, a small movement that communicated conclusion without requiring a raised voice. "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the commission this afternoon. I'd prefer to file it after hearing that Bluestone has voluntarily paused construction. But I'll file it either way." Something changed in Daly's expression, not anger, not capitulation, but the specific look of a man who has been outmaneuvered by a sequence of events moving faster than his authority to respond to them. "Give me until noon," he said. "I'll send another telegraph. You have until noon." He left. Gus watched him go, finished the last of the coffee, and looked at Tempe. You meant that about the commission. Every word. It'll create enemies. I already have enemies. At least these ones will be on record." He turned the empty cup in his hands, studying its bottom with the mild interest he brought to most things. "You found the road problem yourself, before he did. I had more time in the field. You had more time because it's your field." He set the cup down on the fence post. "That's not a small thing. Knowing land is not the same thing as measuring it. The measuring is useful. The knowing is why the measuring tells you something." She didn't answer, because he was right and they both knew it, and saying so would have been the kind of redundancy that Gus had no patience for. The noon telegraph brought a 1-sentence message from Bluestone's Louisville office. Construction on the western berm section had been suspended pending further review. Less than she wanted, and more than she had expected by noon of that particular day. She recorded it in the notebook with the same unadorned precision she brought to the water measurements, because a partial concession documented in real time was worth considerably more than one remembered afterward. She filed the complaint with the commission anyway. She had promised she would. The following morning she went back to the 6th hole and dug it deeper. She went down 2 additional feet with the spade before the clay closed back in, giving her a sand layer roughly 26 inches thick at that location. She tested the saturation by pressing a dry cloth squared against the sand face and counting the seconds before it darkened. 11 seconds to full saturation. The water was moving actively through the sand, not sitting still. She recorded the depth and the saturation time and the changed dimensions, then sat back on her heels at the edge of the hole and did the arithmetic she had been deferring. A 26-inch sand layer, fully saturated, beneath 12 to 18 inches of packed clay subgrade, beneath the repeated impact loading of freight wagons carrying 2 tons or more per load. The clay cap was the only thing between the road surface and the saturated sand. Compression created microfractures. Microfractures let water through. She was not a geological engineer. She had not been to a school in Cincinnati or Louisville or anywhere else that taught formal science. What she had instead was 18 years of working a particular piece of ground in all its seasons, an additional 3 years of working it alone and therefore watching it more carefully than she ever had before, and a precise and honest notebook that now contains 6 weeks of daily measurements, 6 hand-dug test profiles, and a series of observations about ground behavior that any trained geologist would recognize as reliable field data. Because reliable field data looked the same regardless of who collected it. She knew what the road was going to do. She knew it the way she had known on the 14th of March that the water was coming from underground and not from rainfall, not because she had been taught the theory, but because she had watched the evidence accumulate one entry at a time. She filled the hole back in, tamped it level, and walked to the barn. Rowena was inside, forking hay to Canaan and Ezra from the loft ladder, working with the practiced ease of someone who has done this task so many times that her mind was somewhere else entirely, while her hands did it correctly. She came down the ladder when she heard her mother come in. "The road soft?" Rowena asked. She had been watching the fieldwork from the kitchen window and had drawn her own conclusions. "Soft enough. What happens when the gravel wagons go over soft ground? You'll likely see it before I can tell you." Tempe checked the water bucket in Ezra's stall, found it full, moved to Canaan's. "I want you to pay attention to what happens over the next few days." Rowena climbed back up 2 rungs of the loft ladder, enough to see out the high barn window toward the road. "Are you going to warn them?" "I'm going to tell the county commission what I know." "That's the same thing. Not to Mr. Daly directly. Mr. Daly has the same information I have. He has better equipment than I do for analyzing it." She set the bucket in the stall. "If he hasn't reached the same conclusion, that's not my failure." Rowena was quiet for a moment, still looking out the high window. "It seems like you'd want to tell him directly, if you knew something that was going to hurt people." It was a fair observation, and Tempe considered it without dismissing it and without rushing the answer. There's a difference between telling someone what you know and being responsible for what they choose to do with it. I've told the commission. I've told Daly's company through the core sample conversation. If they choose to run loaded wagons over a compromised road for 2 more weeks while they wait for a review, that choice belongs to them. But the road is their road. She looked at her daughter on the ladder, at the particular expression Rowena wore when she was pushing an idea to its limits. "You're right that it matters. I'm not dismissing that, but I've given them what I have. The next step is theirs." The next step turned out to be the morning of the 22nd of April. It had rained the night before, a real rain, the first substantial one in weeks. It came in before midnight and ran hard for 4 hours, 3/4 of an inch, by Tempe's gauge on the porch post, falling onto ground that was already saturated to within inches of its capacity. The water in her fields did not rise much from the rain itself. What it did was add the final increment of pressure to a system that had been building for 6 weeks. She heard it at 5:30 in the morning, a low rushing percussion, not loud, not violent, more like the sound of a buried thing releasing than anything she could name from experience. She went out without her coat. The western section of Bluestone's berm had not failed catastrophically. It had subsided. A stretch of perhaps 35 feet along the central berm section had dropped 2 to 3 feet, the compacted clay giving way along the line of the old underground channel, the wood timbers tilting inward as the ground beneath them lost its coherence. The gap was not large. It was large enough. Water was moving through the breach in both directions simultaneously. Outward to the north in the direction of natural drainage and backward, eastward, toward the excavation site on the upstream side. She watched from the fence line as the drainage pattern shifted. The water on her fields was moving. For the first time in 6 weeks, it was moving in the right direction, pulled by gravity toward the breach, seeking the path the breach had opened. The movement was slow. It would take days. But it was movement, and she watched it for a long time with the particular attention of someone who has been watching the absence of a thing long enough that its presence, when it finally arrives, requires a moment to believe. Then she looked south. The county road ran across her southern boundary in a straight line, and in the early gray light, she could see the surface clearly enough. Near the road's midpoint, in the stretch that passed directly above the secondary channel she had mapped from the test holes, the road surface had changed overnight. There was a longitudinal depression running approximately 25 feet along the road's center. Subtle but unmistakable once you were looking for it, the gravel surface dipped below the surrounding grade by perhaps 3 to 4 inches, the edges slightly raised where the subsurface material had shifted and pushed the clay subgrade up on both sides of the central failure. She stood at her fence line and looked at it and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. The road was failing exactly as she had understood it would, because the physics beneath it had never been going to produce a different outcome, regardless of what anyone wanted or believed or permitted. Underground water moving through sand did not read permits. It did not attend commission meetings. It did not adjust its behavior based on whether anyone believed in its existence. It simply did what pressure and gravity and the path of least resistance required it to do, and it had been doing exactly that since the day Bluestone drove the first timber into the berm. She went back inside and wrote the entry in the notebook. Date, time, observed subsidence of berm western section, estimated extent 35 feet, estimated drop 2 to 3 feet, breach developing. Observed surface deformation of county road. Longitudinal settlement, approximate length 25 feet, 3 to 4 inch depression relative to surrounding grade. Edges slightly heaved. She included the time of the rainfall, the previous night, and the gauge measurement. Then she went to get Gus. He was already walking across the field toward her when she stepped outside. He had heard the same sound she had, been standing at his own fence watching the breach since before she came out. He had a long way to walk, and he walked it at his own pace, arriving at her gate with the unhurried quality of a man who knows that what he's about to see will still be there when he gets to it. They went to the berm first. The breach was developing as she had observed, the subsidence deepening as the water pressure equalized through the gap, the upstream side of the berm beginning to slump on either side of the failure. Two of Bluestone's overnight watchmen were there already, standing at a safe distance from the active settlement, neither of them senior enough to make a decision about what to do next. They recognized Gus but looked at Tempe differently, with the expression of men who have just seen a thing they were told was not going to happen and are still recalibrating. The road, Gus said, looking at the berm and not at the watchman. Have you walked it yet? She shook her head. They went south. The depression was worse in daylight and close up than it had appeared from her fence line. The central zone of the failure was not simply settled. The surface gravel had fractured along the longitudinal axis of the depression, creating a ragged split that ran the full length of the affected area. Beneath the gravel, where the split was widest, the clay subgrade had darkened with moisture, wet in a way that indicated water moving up from below rather than down from above. Around the edges of the depression, in the shallow ditch beside the road, a thin film of silty water was running, not from the ditch drainage, but upwelling from the road shoulder itself. Gus crouched at the ditch edge. He held his palm flat an inch above the surface and felt the temperature differential. Cold air rising from the upwelling. Groundwater, not surface. She already knew. She knelt beside him and looked at the water in the ditch, at the way it was moving, not draining down the ditch toward the lower ground as it should, but issuing from the shoulder laterally, spreading into the ditch from the side. If a loaded wagon runs over that depression, she said, the subgrade will punch through. He stood up. Once the clay breaks, the sand will follow the load. The road will go down to whatever depth the sand layer extends. He looked at the length of the failure. The whole section is at risk. Not just the 25 feet, everything above that channel. She looked at the road in both directions. Bluestone's first wagon of the morning would leave the excavation site at 7 o'clock. She knew this because she had observed their schedule for 3 weeks. The pattern of freight movements as regular as a clock, the sign of an efficient operation, and at this moment of an imminent problem. It was 6:43. She walked quickly back to her house, saddled Kanan in 4 minutes. The horse understanding from her movements that this was not an ordinary morning, and rode north along the fence line road at a canter, arriving at the county road junction just as the first Bluestone wagon came around the upper bend with its load. She put herself in the road with Kanan broadside across the wagon's path, which was not a comfortable position for either of them, but it was unambiguous. The driver pulled up. He was a large man with a short red beard who looked at her with the particular expression of someone who does not understand what they're seeing, but understands it is not a problem they can go around. The road's failed ahead, she said, south of my boundary fence. If you take that load over it, you'll lose the wagon. The driver looked past her at the road. I don't see. You will when you're in it. She kept Kanan steady. The ground under the road is saturated sand. It failed overnight. I've been watching the conditions for 3 weeks, and I'm telling you what's there. That is your wagon and your team, do what you like. But I've told you. He sat for a long moment, looking from her to the road and back. He was not a stubborn man. He was a cautious one, which was different. Stubborn men went forward. Cautious ones waited. I'll hold here, he said, till someone from the company looks at it. She moved Kanan out of the road. Daly arrived 40 minutes later, riding hard from the direction of Caldwell. He went directly to the road depression, crouched over it the way Buckner had crouched over the core sample 2 days before. Pressed his hand against the split surface, felt the moisture coming up through the gravel. He looked at the breach in the berm 200 yards north. He looked at the ditch running with upwelled groundwater. He looked at the depression and its fractured surface and its heaved edges. Then he stood and looked at Tempe, who had ridden back and was sitting Kanan at the field edge, watching all of this. His face had lost the quality it had carried through every conversation before this morning. The residual confidence of a man who still believed the situation was manageable by trained professionals with the right equipment. What was there instead was simpler. He was looking at evidence that could not be reinterpreted. He walked toward her without any of the professional distance he had maintained in previous meetings. The secondary channel, he said. You knew it ran under the road. I knew it ran south. The test holes told me that. You knew what it would do. She let a moment pass before answering, because the question deserved more than a fast reply. I knew what saturated sand does under load. I've watched enough ground to know how it moves. I told the commission. I told you what I found in the cores. The conclusion was available to anyone who looked at the same information. We should have looked harder. He said it without the hedging of a man protecting his position. He said it as a statement of fact, which is the only form an honest admission can take. She did not accept it, not yet. Accepting it would close the conversation, and the conversation was not yet finished. Your company needs to notify the county about the road. Today. And the berm breach needs to be managed before it destabilizes further. I've already sent a rider to the commission. He looked back at the depression. We'll need to reroute the wagons to the Hendricks Road until the subgrade is repaired. The Hendricks Road runs 3 miles longer. I know. He looked at her with something that was not quite an apology, but contained a recognition that she understood and that required acknowledgement. What do I need to do about your fields? She reached into her coat and produced the single folded sheet she had written out the night before, the 3 conditions, composed at the kitchen table by lamplight while Rowena slept. She had written them before the berm failed, before the road settled, before this morning made any demand unnecessary. She had written them because she had known, with the same knowledge that told her about the sand and the pressure and the road, that a moment would come when the question was asked directly. She handed him the paper. Read it when you have time, then we'll talk. He took it. Gus was walking toward them from the direction of the berm, moving at his own pace across the wet ground, his boots leaving dark prints in the pale clay. The sun was properly up now, the morning light flat and clear after the rain, the flooded fields throwing it back in long silver sheets. From this distance the water looked still, looked permanent, looked like something that had always been there and meant to stay. It was still moving. She could see the direction of it if she looked carefully, a slow southward pull through the breach. A subtle change in the reflections that told her the flow had established itself and was deepening. It would take more than a morning. It would take more than a day. But the direction was clear, and direction, she had found, was the most important thing to establish. Once water knew where it was going, it generally got there. Gus arrived beside her and looked up at her on the horse with the expression he reserved for situations that had concluded one phase and not yet begun the next. He had seen the road. He had seen Daly reading the sheet of conditions. He had seen the berm. The channel worked exactly as the map said it would, he said. Almost exactly. She adjusted Canaan's reins. There was the second one it didn't show. Which you found. Which the ground showed me. She looked at the retreating water on her fields, watching the slow geometry of its retreat. I just paid attention. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that held something he was deciding whether to say. When he spoke, his voice carried the register he used for things he meant carefully. Your husband knew this land, but you know it different. She considered that. Silas had loved the land the way a man loves something he has worked for and earned, with pride and the deep satisfaction of ownership. She had come to know it the way you come to know another person, by watching what it did under pressure, by learning its silences as well as its expressions, by understanding that what it showed on the surface was not always what was happening underneath. He knew what it could do, she said. I learned what it remembered. Daly was still reading the conditions page, standing 50 yards away in the morning light, the paper held in both hands. The loaded wagon sat on the road where the driver had held it. The berm breach was working, the water finding its old path with the slow patience of something that has been waiting for this moment longer than anyone present had been alive. Rowena appeared at the farm gate, carrying 2 cups and a wrapped cloth that meant she had made biscuits, while the rest of them had been in the field, watching the world rearrange itself. She picked her way across the wet ground toward her mother, without hesitating at the water's edge, stepping around the worst of it with the casual confidence of someone who knows exactly which ground will hold and which will not. She handed a cup up to Tempe and one to Gus, and stood between them looking at the berm, at the breach, at the road, at the retreating water, at Daly reading the conditions page in the morning light. She looked at all of it with the focused attention of someone who understands that what they are seeing is worth understanding completely. And then she looked up at her mother. Is it going to be all right? The question was simple and the answer was not, which was true of most questions that mattered. Tempe drank the coffee, still hot, which meant Rowena had timed it deliberately, and looked at her flooded acres and the gap in the berm and the conditions page in Prescott Daly's hands. It's going to be different than it was, she said. Whether that's all right depends on what we make of what's different. Rowena considered this, then nodded once, in the way she nodded when she was filing something away for later rather than accepting it fully in the present. She was 15 years old and already learning to hold open questions without forcing them closed, which Tempe recognized as the most useful thing a person could learn, and the hardest to teach deliberately. Daly folded the conditions page and walked back toward them across the clay field. His boots were dirty now, properly dirty, Merritt County dirty in a way that wouldn't brush off before it dried. He held the page at his side. "I'll need 3 days," he said, "not for the geology. The lawyer's in Louisville." Tempe looked at him over the rim of the cup. 3 days. The water was still retreating on the eastern fields, still finding its way through the breach, still doing the work that 6 weeks of standing still had interrupted. 3 days was 3 more entries in the notebook, 3 more mornings of measurement, 3 more incremental changes in a landscape that had been changing since March. 3 days, she said. The 3 days passed the way consequential waiting always does, not slowly but unevenly, some hours lasting minutes and others lasting the length of a season. The water retreated another 14 inches from the eastern fields. In that time, the breach in the berm, working steadily through, each day and night, the ancient channel doing what it had always done before someone built a wall across its memory. By the third morning, the fence posts along the eastern boundary were visible again, standing at odd angles where the flood pressure had leaned them, but standing, which was more than she had expected when she drove the markers in March. She measured every morning at the same hour. She wrote every entry in the same format. The numbers moved in the right direction for the first time in 6 weeks, and she recorded that movement without celebration, because the retreat of damage is not the same as the absence of it. And 61 acres of winter wheat and corn, preparation lost to standing water, was not a thing that corrected itself with a favorable turn of weather. Rowena had organized the barn without being asked, restacking the seed grain that had been elevated against flooding, cleaning the harness leather that had gone stiff in the damp, checking the hand tools for rust with the methodical attention she brought to anything she decided was worth doing properly. She worked in the afternoons after her morning lessons, which she continued at the kitchen table with the same books, regardless of what was happening in the fields outside. Tempe had asked her once, during the worst week of the flooding, whether she wanted to pause the studies until things settled. Rowena had looked at her mother with an expression that communicated the question was not worth answering, and Tempe had not asked again. On the morning of the 4th day, a rider arrived from Caldwell with a message from Bluestone's Louisville office. The message was brief and formal and addressed to her by name, which was itself a small but legible change from the earlier communications, which had addressed themselves to the property owner or the undersigned or the holder of the relevant acreage, as though the land had filed the complaint without assistance. The message requested a meeting at the Caldwell courthouse the following afternoon. It named a representative who would be present: Cornelius Mabb, Vice President of Field Operations, Bluestone Quarry and Gravel Company, Louisville. She read the message twice, folded it, put it in the notebook. Then she rode to Gus. He was in the back field, working a section of fence his low pasture water had damaged when it crossed his property line in the 3rd week of flooding, driving new posts with a mallet while Judge, his oldest ox, stood nearby in the patient way of an animal that associates the sound of work with the proximity of people it trusts. Gus heard her horse and kept working, finishing the post he was driving before he turned. She showed him the message. He read it completely rather than quickly. He handed it back. "Mabb," he said, testing the name. Not a lawyer. Vice President of Field Operations, he considered that. Lawyers come to close things down. Operations men come to find out how much something is going to cost them to fix. He picked up the mallet again. That's a different kind of meeting. She spent the evening writing out the 3 conditions again, not because she had forgotten them or changed them, but because the act of writing them helped her hold their sequence clearly, the way she held the sequence of a difficult planting calendar or the schedule of a loan repayment. The first condition was the canal excavation. The second was the crop damage settlement. The third was the inspection requirement for future construction. She looked at each one in turn and asked herself whether she would accept each in isolation, which was a useful question because negotiation rarely produced everything at once. The excavation was first because it was the only thing that would stop the ongoing damage. The settlement was second because it was the accounting of what had already been lost. The inspection requirement was third because it was the future, valuable, but worth trading last if the other two held. She put the notebook away and went to bed at the normal hour. The Caldwell courthouse in the afternoon light had none of the crowded electricity of the April commission meeting. The main room held only 4 people when Tempe arrived: Daly, already there and standing near the window, a younger man arranging papers at the front table, Gus, who had gotten there before her and taken a chair against the wall in the position of someone who intends to observe rather than participate unless observation proves insufficient, and a 4th man standing at the front of the room with his hat in his hands, looking at the 1849 map that someone had already unrolled and laid across the table. Cornelius Mab was 57 years old and built like a man who had spent the early part of his career doing the work he now managed other people to do. His hands showed it, his posture showed it, and the way he looked at the map showed it. Not with the analytical distance of someone reading a document, but with the bodily recognition of someone reading terrain. He looked up when she came in. She had expected someone who would begin with the company's position and work backward from it. Mab began differently. "Before we discuss terms," he said, setting his hat on the chair beside him, "I want to understand what your data shows, not daily summary of it, your original records." She sat down across the table from him, opened the notebook, and put it in the center between them. He pulled it toward him and began reading from the first entry. March 14th, 6:45 in the morning, no precipitation, water first observed at the eastern fence line. He read every entry. It took 12 minutes longer than she had expected, which told her something about what he was looking for. He did not skim, did not flip forward to the summary pages she had added at the back, did not look for the numbers he wanted and ignore the ones he didn't. He read in sequence, event by event, day by day, the record of 6 weeks told in plain language with precise numbers. When he finished, he set the notebook down in the center of the table again, not toward her and not toward himself. He looked at the map. "The secondary channel," he said. "Your test holes found it at the south boundary. Our cores confirmed the sand layer at both your identified locations. Our engineers had no data showing a secondary channel in that position. The 1849 survey doesn't show it either," she said. "I found it by testing the ground, by digging holes with a hand spade, 6 holes. The 5th came up clay, the 6th came up sand." He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man taking inventory. "We have geological staff. We have survey equipment. We have core drilling capability." He looked at the notebook. "We didn't find what you found." "You were measuring the surface," Gus said from his chair against the wall. He said it as information rather than accusation. Mab looked at him. "That's the explanation I've been given. I don't find it a satisfying one." He turned back to Tempe. "I'd like to know how you knew where to dig the 6th hole." It was a genuine question. She thought about how to answer it accurately. "The water sedge grows in rings where sand is close to the surface," she said. "The rings show where the root system is reaching into coarser material. I learned that from Mr. Whitfield. But the 6th hole wasn't at a sedge ring. It was at a spot where the ground felt different underfoot. A different resistance, a different give." She considered how to make that precise enough to be useful. When you walk the same 83 acres every day for 18 years, you learn the specific weight of each part of it. The 6th hole was at a place that felt lighter than it should. Mab looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not immediately categorize. It was something closer to the look a person gives a problem when they realize they have been trying to solve it with the wrong tools. He picked up the conditions page that Daly had brought and laid in front of him. She recognized her own handwriting. He read the 3 conditions the same way he had read the notebook, completely in sequence. Then he set the page flat on the table with both palms. "The excavation, I can authorize that today. The route, the timeline, the cost allocation, those are within my authority." He looked at the page. "The settlement figure, based on market price as of March this year," she said, "not estimated value. Actual Merritt County prices for winter wheat and corn preparation ground. I have the ledger commodity listings." She produced them from her coat. 6 weeks of weekly listings, the relevant prices circled in pencil. He looked at them. $1,640. "That's the calculation. I can show you the acreage and yield estimate it's based on." He waved it off as someone who has already done the arithmetic and arrived at the same number. "The 3rd condition. Any construction within 350 feet of my boundary that involves earthwork or drainage alteration requires an independent geological assessment that I receive and review before work begins." He leaned back slightly. "That's an unusual restriction on a company operating on its own permitted land. Your company's permitted operation on its own land caused 6 weeks of flooding on mine." She met his eyes without moving toward the position or away from it. "The 3rd condition exists to ensure that a second conversation like this one is not necessary." He was quiet again. Outside, the afternoon light was going golden through the courthouse windows. The same windows the April crowd had sat beneath while the laughter moved through the room. The room was different now, smaller and quieter, occupied by people who were trying to solve a problem rather than avoid one. "I'll need to modify the 3rd condition," Mab said. 300 feet instead of 350, and the assessment must be completed within 30 days of notification, or the work proceeds. 325 feet, 45 days. He looked at her for a moment. 325. 40 days. Agreed. He picked up a pen from the table. The younger man had produced it without being asked, which meant he had been in enough of these meetings to know when one was ending, and wrote the modification on the conditions page in the margin beside the 3rd item, initialed it, and slid it across to her. She read the modification, wrote the agreed terms cleanly beside his notation, initialed it, slid it back. He looked at both their initials on the page. I'll have the formal agreement drafted in Louisville and sent back within the week. In the meantime, I'm authorizing the excavation crew to begin work tomorrow morning, and I'm authorizing immediate payment of the settlement to the county clerk's office for release to you. The younger man was already writing. Gus, from his chair against the wall, said nothing. He had the expression he wore when something had concluded the way it was supposed to conclude. Not satisfaction exactly, more the quality of a person watching a familiar process complete itself, as though the outcome had been implicit in the beginning, and only time was required to make it plain. Daly had not spoken during the meeting. He stood near the window where he had been when she arrived, not absent from the room but not present at the table, occupying a position between witness and participant that suited whatever it was he was working through. As she gathered the notebook and the commodity listings and put her coat back on, he moved from the window and came to where she was standing. The crew will start from the north end, he said. Working south along the line you and Mr. Whitfield staked. Your stakes are still in the ground. I didn't pull them. He looked at the table where the conditions page had been, now in Mab's younger man's leather case. The road section above the secondary channel, we'll need to excavate a relief trench along that corridor as well, separate from the main channel work. The subgrade is compromised for a longer stretch than the surface settlement showed. How long? 60 feet, maybe more. We won't know until we open it. He looked at her directly. I'd like you there when we do. You identified the channel. You should see where it goes. She had not expected that. She considered it for a moment. What time? 7 in the morning. She nodded and went out into the afternoon with Gus walking beside her toward where they had tied the horses. The light was long and flat at this hour, the kind of late afternoon light that made the hills east of Caldwell look like something painted rather than something real. Gus walked without hurrying, his hat pushed back at the same angle it had been all day. 325 feet was a good number, he said. It covers both confirmed channel locations with margin. I know. He untied his horse. I meant it was good arithmetic from the start. You were at 350 because you wanted 325. She did not deny it. She had learned the technique from watching Silas sell tobacco at the buyer's market. Know the number you need. Open higher, settle where you meant to land. They rode back in the direction of Sallow Creek with the sun behind them. She thought about the road section. 60 feet or more of compromised subgrade. The sand layer close to the surface, the clay cap fractured in ways the surface depression had only partly revealed. The excavation would solve it, would give the underground water a direct path to the natural drainage route and relieve the pressure that had been building since March. But solving it meant opening it, and opening it meant understanding exactly how far the secondary channel ran and where it connected to the main one. She was at the field before 7 the next morning. The excavation crew Bluestone sent was larger than she had expected. 14 men with long-handled spades and mattocks, 2 with equipment for shoring the trench walls if the ground proved unstable, 1 with the core drill for confirmatory sampling ahead of the cut. Buckner was with them, moving the crew into position with the quiet efficiency of a man who has organized this kind of work many times. Daly arrived at 7:05, looked at the crew placement, made one adjustment to where the initial cut would begin, and then came to where Tempe was standing at the edge of the staked corridor. The stakes were still there, the red-painted wood she had driven with Gus 3 weeks before, marking the route of the 1849 channel across her property and northward toward the berm breach. In the morning light, the red paint was vivid against the pale clay, each stake its own small declaration that something existed here which deserved marking. We'll start at your property line and work north, Daly said. Match up with the berm breach location. Then the relief trench on the road corridor, south of your line. The road section will take longer. We don't know the full extent of the compromised subgrade until we're in it. The first spades went into the ground at 7:30. The soil in the staked corridor cut more easily than the surrounding field. A detail she noticed immediately, and that Buckner noticed at the same time, looking up at her from the trench edge, with an expression that confirmed they were both reading the same thing. Easier cutting meant less clay density, which meant the sand layer was shallower here than in the surrounding ground. At 2 feet, the first sand appeared. Not a layer, a lens, a curved pocket of coarser material curling up toward the channel centerline. At 3 feet, the spades hit the main sand body, and the water that had been held in it, under pressure, issued from the cut face, with an immediate purposeful flow that soaked the trench bottom in seconds, and began moving down the grade of the excavated corridor, toward the south, toward the natural drainage route, toward the place where the ground remembered how to let water pass. Nobody cheered, the crew kept digging. But 2 of the men near the front of the cut exchanged a look that contained something, not surprise exactly, not relief exactly, but the recognition of people who work with the ground and understand that when water moves the way it is supposed to move, something has been corrected that should not have been wrong in the first place. The trench moved north across her property through the morning. Buckner tracked the sand layer's depth and width at each station, calling numbers to the young man behind him who recorded them in a survey ledger. Daly walked the length of the cut every hour, crouching at intervals to look at the trench face, occasionally asking Buckner a question. Tempe walked the length of the cut once at mid-morning, looking at the sand layer in cross-section. The way it widened in the central channel and narrowed at the edges, the way it was still fully saturated, despite the flow that had been releasing for 2 hours, the depth of the pressure that had accumulated. The channel was not a thin seam. At its widest point, it was nearly 4 feet across and 2 feet thick, and it ran continuous from the first opening to the berm breach location, where the northern end of the excavation met the existing breach, and the water pressure equalized with an audible rushing sound, like a room that has been held too long under breath finally exhaling. In the afternoon, they moved to the road section. Buckner ran the core drill ahead of the excavation cut, sampling at 10-foot intervals along the road corridor south of her property line. The results were worse than the surface depression had indicated. The sand layer here was shallower. In 2 locations, less than 20 inches below road grade. The clay cap above it had fractured in a pattern that followed the wagon track ruts, the repeated loading having worked the clay until the individual aggregate particles lost their cohesion. Buckner showed her one of the cores from the fractured zone. The clay came out in small, irregular pieces rather than a continuous cylinder, and when he pressed the pieces together, they didn't reform. The structure was gone. How much of this would have failed if the morning freight run had gone through, she asked. Buckner lined up 4 core cylinders in order of their sampling position. These 4 stations. Minimum. He pointed to the outer 2. Possibly these as well, if the leading wagon broke the cap at the first station and the trailing wagons followed into the opening. It wouldn't have been a gradual thing. Once the cap breaks, the sand beneath loses its lateral support and the whole section drops. She thought about the driver with the red beard who had held his team at her signal, the man with the cautious disposition who had waited rather than pushed through because she had put Canaan broadside across his path and told him plainly what was underneath. The excavation of the road corridor took the rest of the day, and part of the next morning, the crew cutting a relief trench along the channel route and installing a timber-lined drainage channel at the appropriate grade to carry the subsurface flow south and east to the existing drainage network at the county road's lower end. It was careful work, slower than the field excavation, requiring more attention to the shoring because the road's surface had to be restored once the subgrade was corrected. She watched it for 2 hours on the second morning, then left Buckner's crew to it and went back to her fields. The water level on the eastern acreage had dropped 26 inches from its peak by the morning of the second day of excavation. The measurement rod that had been submerged for 4 weeks was visible above the waterline again, its notched markings readable, its red thread marker now hanging free in the air above the current water surface. She recorded the level and date and time. 43 acres dry, 40 still damp, 20 still holding standing water in the lowest zone. The lowest zone was where she spent the afternoon. The ground there when she walked it was not what it had been before the flood. The surface showed the characteristic pattern of receding water, a fine silt deposit over the existing soil, pale gray in color, forming a thin continuous crust that crinkled underfoot like paper drying. Beneath that crust, when she broke it with the toe of her boot, was dark material, darker than the surrounding field soil, heavier in texture, with a mineral smell that was distinct from the ordinary smell of spring soil warming. River sediment, the fine suspended particles that traveled furthest from their source and laid down last when the water finally retreated. She picked up a handful and felt its weight and texture. It was exactly what Silas had described finding in the low acres after the 1871 high water, the year before she arrived at this farm as his wife. He had described it as the river paying its rent, the price the land collected for being willing to hold water for a season, deposited in the form of the finest and most fertile particles the Licking River carried. She had listened to that description as a young woman and understood it intellectually. She understood it differently now, standing in the damp ground with river silt in her hand and 61 flooded acres behind her. Gus came by in the late afternoon, moving along the edge of the recovering field. He stopped where she was standing and looked at the silt crust on the ground. "Same as 53, he said. Your father's year. And the ones before that if his father told it right." He crouched, broke a section of the crust, held the material in his palm. "This will settle into the existing soil by August. By September, that zone will be the richest ground on your property." She had reached the same estimate. The 20 acres that had been underwater longest, the lowest, hardest ground to farm in dry years because of its density, would carry the season's nutrient deposit in concentrated form. The flood had not simply receded. It had left something. The Kentucky Geological Survey letter arrived on a Wednesday, a response, finally, to the March letter she had sent to Frankfurt, delayed by the survey's backlog and by what she gathered was a departmental consultation about what her report contained. The letter was longer than she expected and signed by two names, both with academic titles she recognized as geological credentials. It requested permission to conduct a hydrological survey of the Sallow Creek drainage basin, citing her case as evidence of subsurface channel networks not represented in existing state survey data. They offered a fee for land access. They said the survey would take 2 field seasons. They said the resulting data would be incorporated into the state's geological records and would be available to adjacent property owners and to county planning offices. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table. Rowena came in from the barn and read it over her shoulder. "They're going to come here and map the whole thing," Rowena said. "That's what the letter says. Because of what you found. Because of what the ground showed." She set the letter down. "I sent them the notebook entries. They would have had the same information from anyone who kept the same records." Rowena pulled out the chair across from her and sat, the familiar position of someone settling in for a conversation rather than a quick exchange. She had the alert, slightly forward quality she brought to things she was working out. "The ground didn't fill a notebook with measurements. You did." Tempe looked at her daughter across the table. Rowena was 15 and would turn 16 in October and had the particular kind of intelligence that did not announce itself through performance but through precision. The ability to find the exact place where a thing was true and to put her finger on it without ceremony. "Both things are true," Tempe said. The letter from the Kentucky Sportsmen's Association arrived 2 weeks after the geological survey letter, forwarded through the county clerk's office from an address in Lexington. The association had read the preliminary survey notes circulated by the Geological Survey Office and were interested in the aquatic habitat potential of the Sallow Creek bottomland. Specifically, they were interested in a seasonal fishing access arrangement covering the lower acreage. She read that letter more carefully than she had read the Geological Survey one, because the Geological Survey was about information, and this one was about money, and money required more careful reading than information. The association was offering $320 per year for seasonal fishing access to 20 acres of the lowest bottomland. The contract they proposed was for 5 years. The access season would run from September through February, which was outside her main working period on those acres. They wanted the right to install temporary fishing platforms, removable, no permanent footings, which she read as a negotiating position rather than a requirement. She put the letter in the notebook and rode to Caldwell to look at the county rate listings for the agricultural land around Merritt County. The 20 lowest acres of her property on the current assessment rolls were valued at $11 per acre. Annual agricultural income from those acres in a good year was perhaps $8 per acre before expenses. $320 per year for seasonal access to 20 acres was $16 per acre. And those acres would still be hers, still carry the annual sediment deposit from any high water, still connect to the rest of the farm's drainage and wildlife patterns. She wrote out her response to the association at the kitchen table that evening. She accepted the base arrangement. She declined the permanent platform footings and proposed removable structures with specifications she described precisely. She requested a clause allowing her to terminate the agreement with 60 days' notice if agricultural circumstances required the acreage to be returned to full cultivation. She noted that access from the south boundary required use of the county road, which Bluestone was currently repairing, and that the access path would need to be confirmed once that work was complete. She sent the response on a Thursday. On Saturday morning, the fish appeared. She had not expected them. Gus had not warned her specifically, though she understood afterward that he had been waiting for something like it, because when she found him at the edge of the recovering low acres and told him what she was seeing, he looked at the shallow pools with the expression of someone who has finally received news they had been expecting for a while. The pools were the remnant of the flood, shallow still, contained by the slight natural berms of the field's topography, holding perhaps 6 inches of water over the silt-covered ground. They should not have held fish. They were isolated from the creek by a quarter-mile of dry ground. But in the clearer pools at the edge of the water, moving slowly through the submerged grass stubble, were juvenile smallmouth bass and pumpkin seed sunfish in numbers she could not immediately count. Dozens in the first pool she looked at, more in the 2 adjacent ones, their small forms visible against the pale silt bottom. "The channel," Gus said, standing beside her at the pool edge. When the excavation opened the sand layer, the connection to the licking drainage ran both ways. Water out and water in, the kind that carries what the river carries. He watched the fish move through the stubble. "My father said the same thing happened in '53. He caught enough for 3 weeks of meals from his low field after the water receded." She looked at the pools and thought about the Kentucky Sportsmen's Association letter in the back of the notebook, and about the survey letter, and about the character of the lowest 20 acres. The acres she had considered the weakest part of her property, the acres that flooded soonest and drained slowest, and were hardest to work in wet years. She thought about those acres with the fish moving through them, with the silt deposit on their surface, with the old river channel confirmed to run beneath them by core drilling and hand excavation, and the memory of an 1849 map. She thought about what Silas had said about bottomland in the year they first walked this property together. That you didn't buy flood-prone ground despite what it did in high water. You bought it because of what it did in high water. You bought it for the season after. The crop damage settlement from Bluestone arrived at the county clerk's office on the 22nd of May, $1,640. She collected it on a Tuesday morning, rode to the Caldwell Bank, and paid 3 months ahead on the equipment note she had taken the previous fall for the new corn planter. That left $1,100 and some in hand, which was more liquidity than she had held at any point since Silas died, and which she did not celebrate because it represented the price of 61 drowned acres, and was therefore not a thing to celebrate, only to account for accurately. She put $900 into the bank account and used the remainder to replace the fence line along the eastern boundary. New posts, new wire. The work done in a week with help from the same neighbors who had watched the flood rise in March from the road's edge, several of whom worked without charging her, and several of whom charged fair and got paid what they asked. Gus came by on the last day of the fencing to bring water for the workers and to stand at the completed line looking at it the way he looked at finished work, with the specific quality of satisfaction that comes from seeing something that needs doing done correctly. The association letter, he said, not looking at her. You sent the response? 3 weeks ago. Any answer? Not yet. These things move at their own pace. He turned his hat in his hands, looking at the new fence line against the recovering field. The low acres were fully dry now, the silt crust breaking down into the soil in the way she had predicted, the ground beginning to show the color of productive soil rather than the pale gray of deposited mineral. The fish pools had dried in the first week of June, the fish having returned to whatever channel brought them, leaving behind nothing visible except the memory of their presence. Your husband bought this land because nobody else wanted it, Gus said. He bought it because he understood it. He understood what it could do in a good year. Gus settled his hat back on his head. You found out what it could do in a bad one. He looked at the low acres, at the recovering surface, at the new posts along the boundary. That's not the same knowledge. She stood beside him looking at the same ground. The late afternoon was settling over the fields in the particular way of June evenings in Merritt County. Long light, the air holding warmth without urgency, the smell of soil that was working again after weeks of standing water. Somewhere in the low acres a red-winged blackbird was moving between the remaining grass tufts, which meant the ground was recovered enough to support its weight, which was more than she had been certain of a month ago. He taught me to watch it, she said. I learned what I learned by watching. Most things can't be taught, Gus said. They can only be learned. He turned toward his horse, moving with the unhurried quality of a man at the end of a day that has been satisfying without being easy. I expect the association will write back. She expected so too. The geological survey team arrived in August, 2 men from the Frankfurt office with equipment designed for shallower, systematic sampling across wide areas. They worked through her property in 3 days, methodical and quiet, recording their findings in a survey ledger that they shared with her each evening. She read every entry. On the second evening, she pointed out 2 locations where their probe readings didn't match what her test holes had found the previous spring, and they reopened those locations and found that her hand-dug data was correct, and their instrument had read the surface clay rather than the underlying material. They noted the correction and thanked her without condescension, which was the kind of professional exchange she had hoped for, and half expected not to receive. On the last evening before they packed their equipment, the senior surveyor, a careful thin man named Alderton, who wore small wire spectacles and spoke in the measured way of someone who has learned that precision in language prevents revision later, sat with her at the kitchen table and showed her the composite map they had assembled over the 3 field days. The map was more detailed than the 1849 original. It showed the main channel, the secondary channel she had found with the 6th test hole, 2 additional minor channels that the systematic sampling had revealed, and the full extent of the sand layer network beneath the Sallow Creek bottomland. It was a document of what existed underground, the old paths, the memory of the river's earlier choices, the infrastructure of water movement that predated every fence and field boundary on the surface above it. Alderton pointed to the secondary channel, the one she had found. On the new map, it connected not just southward to the county road corridor, but extended further, curving east and eventually joining a larger sand body that ran beneath the eastern edge of Bluestone's current excavation area. The same water network that Bluestone's berm had pressurized ran under and around the excavation site itself, connecting back to the Licking River drainage in a route that the original channel map had not shown because the 1849 survey had not reached that far east. She looked at that connection for a long time. If they excavate further east, she said, they'll be working directly above this connection point. Alderton adjusted his spectacles. Yes, the sand layer there is close to the surface, within 2 feet in several locations we sampled. Any significant earthwork above it would need to account for the hydrostatic pressure from the connected network. He paused. I'll note that in the formal report. Make sure Merritt County receives a copy. Standard distribution. He began rolling the map, and to the landowner of record on all adjacent properties. She watched him roll the map with the care of someone who understood that documents of this kind had a life beyond their immediate purpose. The 1849 map was in the back bedroom now, in its leather cylinder, occupying the shelf where Gus had first retrieved it. She thought about it sometimes when she was working the field, the fact that it existed, that Gus's father had carried it through decades of ordinary life, that it had been waiting in a back room for 38 years for the moment when the land would need it. Some things that look useless are simply waiting for the right question to be asked of them. The association's response arrived in the 3rd week of August, a formal letter of agreement with her proposed modifications incorporated, the temporary platform specifications accepted as written, the 60-day termination clause included without objection. The first payment was enclosed as a bank draft. $320 for the season running September through February. She held the draft for a moment before putting it with the other documents in the notebook. Rowena came in from the barn. She had taken over the full feeding schedule for Canaan and Ezra during the busy weeks and had not returned the task to her mother, which Tempe had noticed and not commented on. She was growing into the farm the way a person grows into the work they were built for, not by becoming less herself, but by finding where she fit. Did it come? Rowena asked. Yes. Rowena leaned against the kitchen doorframe, looking at her mother with the direct attention she had always brought to whatever she considered worth looking at. What will you do with it? Tempe looked at the bank draft and then out the window at the low acres, where the silt had worked into the soil and the ground had taken on the color and character of the most productive bottomland in the county. Dark, dense, alive with the microbiology that river sediment carries. The acres that the neighbor at the courthouse had called too risky to plant. The acres that Bluestone had called too flood-prone to be worth protecting. The acres that had been underwater for 6 weeks and had emerged from that experience richer than they had gone in. Save some, she said. Repair the east drainage tile. Put the rest against the note. She set the draft in the notebook, the same things I always do. Rowena nodded once. She pushed off from the doorframe and went back to whatever she had come in from, her boots tracking the particular clay and silt mixture of the recovering fields across the kitchen floor. Tempe remained at the table a moment longer, the notebook closed in front of her, the bank draft inside it. Outside, the fields were beginning to hold the blue grave of a late summer evening, that hour when the land goes quiet and the light travels long and sideways across the ground, and you can see if you know where to look, the faint depressions and rises that tell the story of what has happened there. Where water has been, where it has worked, what it has left behind. She had filed the complaint. She had measured the damage. She had dug the holes and read the cores and stood in the road with her horse broadside against the wagon's path and handed a man a piece of paper with 3 conditions written on it in plain language. And she had waited while the county and the company and the water itself sorted out which of them understood the land they were dealing with. She did not think of herself as having won something. Winning implied a contest with a clear boundary, and this had never felt like a contest. It had felt like the land presenting a problem that required someone to pay attention to it. And she had been the person who paid attention, and this was simply what followed from that. She picked up the notebook, went to the hook by the kitchen door, took her coat, and stepped out onto the porch. The evening air carried the smell of the creek and the turned soil and the wet clay of the rebuilt fence posts along the eastern line. Somewhere in the direction of Gus's property, a barn door was being closed. She could hear it in the particular way barn doors close, when the person closing them has been doing it for 50 years, with a certain economy of motion that produces a clean, final sound. She stood on the porch and listened to it and looked at her 83 acres in the last of the light. The following spring, Prescott Daly submitted a revised operational assessment to the Merritt County Commission before beginning any new excavation work on the eastern portion of Bluestone's lease. The assessment included a full subsurface hydrological survey, historical channel mapping, and a drainage impact analysis for all adjacent properties within 500 feet. It was the first such assessment the county had required of a commercial extraction operation, and the language requiring it had been drafted in part from the 3rd condition on a handwritten sheet of paper that Daly still carried in his field ledger, folded into the back flap where he kept documents he considered worth keeping. He had never returned the sheet to Tempe, and she had never asked for it back, because the condition was already part of the county record, and the paper was only paper. What mattered was that the language existed and was being applied, which was exactly what she had intended when she wrote it. The Kentucky Geological Survey published their findings from the Sallow Creek Drainage Assessment in the spring of 1889. The report identified 7 previously unknown subsurface channel networks in the Merritt County bottomland, detailed the conditions under which those networks created drainage pressure on adjacent properties, and recommended specific survey protocols for any commercial operations within the identified corridor. It cited the work of 2 field surveyors and the original data collection that had prompted the survey, noted in the report's acknowledgments as field observations submitted by a private landowner, Merritt County, Kentucky, March through April 1887, which was as much attribution as such reports customarily gave, and which Tempe considered adequate. Rowena left for Berea College in September of 1888. She was 16 years old, dark-haired, carrying a leather satchel that had been Silas's, and 2 books she had borrowed from the county lending library and not yet returned, which she intended to mail back once she was settled. She and Tempe stood at the wagon on the morning she left, and looked at each other for a moment in the early light. "You'll write," Tempe said, "every week." Rowena adjusted the satchel strap. "More if something happens. Something will always happen, then every week plus more." She looked at the house, at the fields behind it, at the low acres catching the morning light in the particular way they caught it, now that the silt had worked into the soil, and the ground was richer than it had been before the flood. "I'll come back in the summers. The farm will be here." Rowena climbed up into the wagon, took the reins, and looked down at her mother from that height. "You're going to be all right." It was not a question. Tempe recognized it as the thing Rowena had learned about her over the years. Not that everything would be fine, not that hardship was temporary, but something more specific and more accurate. That her mother would be all right in the way that a person is all right, when they understand the ground they are standing on. "I know," Tempe said. "Go." The wagon moved out of the yard and down the lane toward the county road, and Tempe stood and watched it go until it reached the road and turned north toward Caldwell and was no longer visible through the morning trees. She went back inside. She put the kettle on. She took the notebook from the shelf and opened it to the current date, September 4, 1888, and wrote the morning temperature and sky condition, and a note about the west fence needing a new rail before winter, because the habit of writing down what she saw was not a habit she intended to stop. The farm was quiet in the way farms are quiet when they are being properly attended. Canaan and Ezra were in the pasture, moving slowly through the tall grass of the south field. The low acres were fully into their second season of improved production. The corn there had come in better than any crop those acres had ever produced. The silt deposit from the previous spring's flooding, having done exactly what Gus had said it would do by September. She had sold the surplus at a price that more than covered the equipment note, and what remained she had stored in the granary against a bad year, because she had learned that storing against a bad year was not pessimism. It was the same impulse that had made her drive measurement stakes into a flooding field and keep a notebook and dig 6 holes until the 6th one told her something. Gus came by that afternoon, as he often did when he knew she had work she might want company for, or when he simply felt like walking the boundary of the 2 properties in the way that old farmers walk land. Not to inspect it exactly, more to confirm that it is still itself, still doing what it was always doing, still holding the particular character that makes a piece of ground worth knowing. They walked the south boundary together, the repaired road smooth and solid again under their boots, the drainage channel running cleanly along the road corridor in the timberline trench that Bluestone's crew had cut 6 months before. The water moved through it with a sound she had come to associate with things working correctly. Not silence, not roar, but the middle register of water finding its course and following it. At the southeast corner of the property they stopped and looked east toward Bluestone's excavation. The operation was smaller now, more careful, the machinery moving with the deliberateness of people who understood that what they were working above required them to understand it first. She watched it for a moment without particular feeling, not resentment, not satisfaction. Only the ordinary attention she brought to anything happening near her land. "They're doing the eastern section right," Gus said. Alderton's report gave them what they needed. She looked at the channel map in her mind, the new one from 1887, with its 7 identified networks and its clear notation about the connection point beneath the eastern quadrant. "They know what's down there now. Because you found it. Because I was looking." She turned away from the excavation and looked back across her own fields toward the house, at the late afternoon light laying itself across the recovered low acres in long, warm strips. Gus. He was already looking where she was looking. "I see it." She did not say what she saw. She did not need to. He had farmed the land beside hers for 45 years, and he saw it the same way she did, not as a set of fields and fence lines and seasonal yields, but as a piece of ground that had a memory, that held the history of everything that had moved through it, or been buried in it, or worked to the surface, and that would go on holding that history long after both of them were done with it. They walked back in the direction of the house in the particular silence of people who have spent enough time together that they have run out of things that need to be said and arrived at everything that doesn't. In January of 1899, Augustus Whitfield died in his sleep at the age of 84 in the house he had lived in for more than 50 years. The ground was frozen, and the creek was low, and the sky over Sallow Creek had the flat gray quality it held in the deepest part of winter, when the land looked like it was waiting rather than resting, which was a different thing entirely. Tempe had seen him 3 days before, when he came by to return a tool he had borrowed in the fall, and stayed for coffee and sat at her kitchen table, the way he had sat there many times over the years, with his hat on his knee and his hands around the cup, and his attention moving slowly over the things in the room, the way his attention moved over everything, unhurried, missing nothing, finding something worth noticing in the ordinary arrangement of ordinary objects, in a room where a person had been living carefully for a long time. He had not said anything remarkable. He had drunk his coffee and asked about the south drainage, and said he thought the winter was going to break early, which he based on the behavior of the creek ice in the lower reach. And then he had put his hat on and gone out and gotten on his horse and ridden home. And 3 days later, he was gone. She heard about it from a neighbor on the road and rode directly to his house, arriving before any of his children had come from the towns they had settled in. The house was quiet in the way houses go quiet before people arrive to fill them with the noise of grief. She went through the rooms without looking for anything particular and ended up in the back room, at the shelf behind the glass canning jars, where the leather cylinder was still stored in the exact position she remembered. From the first day she had come to ask about the water. She stood and looked at it for a while without taking it down. She went out to the barn. Judge had died 2 years before, and the barn held only a younger ox now, one that Gus had broken himself in the last years of his strength, a steady animal that stood in its stall with the patience of a creature that did not know anything had changed. Tempe went to its stall and put her hand on its neck, and stood there for a moment, feeling the warmth of the animal and the smell of the barn and the particular weight of the quiet that had settled over the property. She did not cry. She was not certain whether that was grief or acceptance or simply the way a person receives the loss of someone who had been so much of the landscape of their life for so long that the absence initially presented as something more like a change in weather than a wound. Pervasive, atmospheric, requiring adjustment in every direction at once. She went back to the house, to the back room, and took the leather cylinder down from the shelf. She opened it and withdrew the 1849 map and unrolled it on the same pine table where she had first seen it, weighting the corners with the same salt cellar and tobacco tin and gray river stone that had been on that table since before she was born. She looked at the map for a long time, the faded blue lines, the small arrows indicating flow direction, the notations in Gus's father's handwriting that had recorded what he saw in the field nearly before any of them had needed to know it. The main channel, the secondary channels, the connection points, all of it underground, all of it invisible from the surface, all of it waiting. She rolled the map carefully and put it back in the cylinder and put the cylinder inside her coat and rode home. The 1849 map occupied the shelf in her back bedroom for 11 more years in its leather cylinder, growing no older in any visible way that she could measure. She showed it to the geological survey teams when they came back for follow-up sampling. She showed it to Rowena when Rowena came home from Berea in the summers, and later when Rowena came back for good, which she did in 1895. Not because she could not find work elsewhere, but because she had decided that what she wanted to do with her education was do it here, on this land, which needed what she had learned and which she understood in a way that no other piece of ground was ever going to be understood by her. Rowena had studied natural history and land science, and she came home with notebooks of her own, and an interest in the aquatic ecology of the bottomland that aligned precisely with what the Kentucky Sportsmen's Association had been discovering through their seasonal access, that the restored connection between the Sallow Creek bottomland and the Licking River drainage had created a habitat that was producing fish populations in numbers that surprised even the association's most optimistic early assessments. She proposed an expansion of the fishing access agreement in 1897, adding 5 more acres to the seasonal arrangement and negotiating a new rate that reflected the improved habitat conditions. She handled the correspondence with the association herself, using the same careful language her mother used in letters, the same habit of stating the terms plainly and without apology that she had watched across the kitchen table for 15 years. Tempe watched all of this with the particular satisfaction of a person who sees something they have prepared for arrive exactly when it was supposed to arrive. She didn't say much about it. She did not need to. Rowena knew what the farm was and what it required and what it was capable of, and she had learned it the same way Tempe had learned it, by being present, by paying attention, by writing down what she saw. The farm was not wealthy by any measure that newspapers used to count such things. It was not large. It had not expanded beyond its original 83 acres. What it had done was survive, not in the passive way of something that simply endures, but in the active way of something that had been understood well enough to be steered through a crisis that had destroyed the seasons of other farms in the county, and which had come through that crisis with the lowest 20 acres richer than they had ever been. On the morning in the autumn of 1910, when Rowena found her mother sitting at the kitchen table with the 1849 map unrolled in front of her, the leather cylinder on the floor beside her chair, Tempe was 52 years old, and the country had changed around the farm in ways that made the 1887 flood feel like a very long time ago, which it was. Rowena stood in the doorway for a moment before Tempe heard her and looked up. "I was thinking," Tempe said, "that this should go somewhere it won't be lost." Rowena came to the table and looked at the map. She had seen it many times, but she looked at it now with fresh attention. The way you look at a thing when you understand its context has shifted. The Historical Library in Frankfurt has a collection. Geological surveys, land office records. I thought of that. They'd take it. I know they would. Tempe looked at the map for another moment, at the faded blue lines and the small arrows and the notation in the upper corner that gave the date. August 1849, Sallow Creek Drainage Survey, Merritt County, Kentucky. I want to write something to go with it, to explain what it was used for. Rowena sat down across from her. "Tell me what you want to say and I'll write it if you want." "No." Tempe smoothed one corner of the map with the flat of her hand. "I'll write it." She wrote it that evening, at the same kitchen table by lamplight, in the same plain sentences she had been writing in the same leather notebook. A different notebook now, the fourth or fifth since 1887, but the same discipline. Write down what you see exactly as you see it, without wishing it were otherwise. She wrote about Gus and his father and the land office survey of 1849. She wrote about the March morning when the water arrived without rain. She wrote about the measuring rod and the red thread and the 6 test holes and the 6th one that came up sand. She wrote about the courthouse meeting and the map unrolled on the front table and the quality of silence that followed it, which was different from the silence that had preceded it. She wrote about the core samples and the road depression and the driver with the red beard who had held his team at her signal because she told him plainly what was underneath, which was the same thing she had been doing all along, telling plainly what was underneath. She wrote, "The map is a record of what was already there. The water channels exist whether they are recorded or not. The value of the record is not that it creates the thing. It is that it makes the thing findable by people who do not yet know to look." She wrote, "Augustus Whitfield kept this map for 38 years because his father told him the land would need it. He was right. Most things his father told him turned out to be right. I kept it for another 23 years because I understood it was not mine to decide when the land might need it again." She wrote, "Give this to wherever it will be cared for and made available. Someone will need it. They may not know yet that they will need it. That is the nature of maps of underground things." She folded the letter and put it inside the leather cylinder alongside the map and resealed the cylinder with a length of new cord because the old cord had gone soft with age, and she did not want the thing to arrive anywhere in a condition that suggested it had not been looked after. Rowena sent the package to the Kentucky Historical Library in Frankfurt the following week, with a cover letter of her own that gave the provenance of the map and the history of its use, written with the particular clarity that comes from having watched someone else do the same thing for 20 years and absorb the method. The library acknowledged receipt and cataloged the map as part of their geological survey collection, where it remained available for anyone who came to look, which over the years a number of people did. Surveyors, county commissioners, geologists from the state university, a reporter once who was writing about the history of gravel extraction along the Licking River, and found the map in the collection and found also the correspondence from Tempe's letter and copied a section of it into his article, without fully understanding what he was copying, though the section he chose was the one about the nature of maps of underground things, which was the part that held the most of what she had meant. Tempe did not read the article. By the time it appeared, she had other things to attend to. The farm continued. The low acres continued to fish. The drainage channel that Bluestone's crew had cut along the county road corridor ran clean and open through every season, carrying the subsurface water of the secondary channel south and east to the drainage network where it had always been heading, doing what water does when it is given the room to do it. Finding the way it was always going to find, arriving where it was always going to arrive, indifferent to the years it had taken to get there. Some mornings, standing at the edge of the low acres in the early light before the rest of the farm had come fully awake, Tempe would look at the ground and think about what was underneath it. The sand channels and the old riverbeds and the pressure systems that moved through the bottomland in patterns that predated. Every name that had ever been given to any piece of this land, patterns that would continue long after every name had been forgotten. She thought about her husband learning the land's productivity and her learning the land's memory, and about Rowena learning something that combined both of those things and added something of her own, which was the way knowledge moved between generations when it was treated as something alive rather than something fixed. She did not think of herself as having done anything extraordinary. She had paid attention to a piece of ground that was hers, and she had written down what she saw, and she had been willing to stand in a road, with a horse broadside across the lane, and tell a man plainly what was underneath. Because telling plainly what was underneath was the only honest thing she knew how to do with information she had. The land went on, holding everything that had ever happened to it, in the sand and the clay and the settled silt of the low acres and the memory of the water that moved through it always, underground and patient and indifferent to whether anyone above it understood what it was doing. She understood. That was enough. That had always been enough.